In my house, we've completely gotten rid of cable and satellite services. Now, I have an 11-year-old who's just about to get out of that Disney princess phase. So as for now, we subscribe to Disney Plus, we have our Amazon account, and we also have Netflix. Even though some of these services have started putting commercials on their streams, commercials are still a rarity for us. So when we go to my mother's house or we go to my mother-in-law's house, we're not used to commercials. We're out of that habit of sitting through 3 minutes of commercials. And when you're out of the habit and you're not exposed to it as much, and you've removed yourself from it, you start to see things in commercials that you didn't see before when you were used to them. Now, the way my brain works is my brain is almost trained to look for patterns. And so when I get exposed to these foreign commercials, I start to see patterns. Now, commercials that we see, they only do one of two things. They either make you a promise to help you avoid pain, or they make you a promise to bring you pleasure. Think about the commercials that you knew or commercials you grew up with. They're really only trying to do one of these two things. In Eastern philosophy, they call this cycle the wheel of suffering. Picture a hamster running on a wheel. That hamster's running because it's either chasing something in its mind or it's running away from something. So the wheel creates either craving or aversion. Like it or not, we are also on this wheel. So we are either chasing the thing that we want or we're running away from the thing that we don't. The problem for us as humans is we fail to recognize that the thing we're chasing or the thing we're running away from is also attached to that wheel, which means we can never ever catch it or we can never ever get away from it. Think about our current culture, our society that exists outside these walls. Think about the message that it sends, especially to our youngest people. Constantly, you are chasing or you are running. This constant chase, this constant running can lead to restlessness, which eventually can lead to unsatisfaction. If you keep piling unsatisfaction on top of unsatisfaction for a long enough period of time, you start to question everything, including your purpose and your meaning in this life. In our scripture today, the author of Hebrews identifies this with the term hardening of hearts. See, as your heart hardens, other things become more difficult, if not impossible, to do. It is difficult, if not impossible, to have a hard heart and be grateful, compassionate, or empathetic. When we do not take time to rest and just continue to be busy being busy, time just seems to pass with nothing really happening, like being on a hamster wheel. Now, if you think this is just a modern problem, I'll remind you that the Psalms were probably written about 3,000 years ago, and Hebrews was written about 2,000 years ago. So this is not a new human problem, but it's more a part of the human condition. So saying that, our question to ourselves is then, so what do we do about it? Do we throw our hands up in the air and go with the flow? Or do we listen? And when I say listen, I mean really, really listen to what God commands us to do. When we think of rest, we like to use our own definitions of rest. Our rest means a week on a beach somewhere. Our rest means stapling your backside to the couch and letting sports or Netflix take you away and give you some type of relief. But I put forward today, I don't think that's the type of rest that God is talking about. Because any time that I've vegged out on the couch for too long, or any time I've been on that beach for a week, I'm more exhausted at the end than I was at the beginning. God doesn't command us to enter into our rest. God commands us to enter into His rest. In verse 11 from our psalm today, it warns us that if we continue to harden our hearts, if we continue to chase and run away and stay on that hamster wheel, God will not allow us to enter into His rest. Now, I'm not an overly smart person, but I think I need to figure out what is the difference between my definition of rest and God's definition of rest. First, God uses a fancy word to describe His rest. It isn't vacation. It isn't chillax. The word that God used for His rest is Sabbath. Now, Sabbath is one of those words that we as modern Christians have kind of cast aside, right? We'll read the 10 Commandments, and we get so pleased with ourselves that we're scoring 90% on the test, right? We go out and we actively try not to murder. We really, really try not to look out our front windows and covet the car or the beautiful lawn that our neighbor has. But the whole Sabbath thing, that's for a different time. God must not have been talking about me for that one. It's too hard in this modern world to honor that commandment that we're keeping us from 100%. Blame the government, we say. They're the ones who said that everything can open on Sunday. Blame the NFL, we say. They're the ones who put all the games on Sunday. But those same stores are still open, and things seem to happen for our Jewish brothers and sisters, yet they're still able to honor Sabbath. If you've ever seen or witnessed a Jewish family preparing for Sabbath, you'll quickly realize how much effort goes into entering God's rest. The things that our Jewish friends realize that we don't is that Sabbath is not about giving stuff up. Sabbath is about gaining something. Gaining one very specific thing. See, it's about eliminating all those distractions that cloud our vision and cloud our attention to God. It's about the barriers that we put up, not governments, not society, not sports league. The barriers that we put up that make it harder and harder for God to break through and get our attention. See, our definition of rest is a passive one. God's definition of rest is an active one. The same can be said about our vacancy right now. So you can approach this vacancy as your rest from doing stuff. Or you can treat it like a Sabbath and treat it as God's rest for this church. As an individual, you can make this vacancy a passive one, or you can make it an active one. As a church family, you can make this vacancy a passive one or an active one. See, as we prepare for Sabbath, we invite the Spirit to be among us, and we actively listen for God's voice. Notice I said actively listen and not hear. Hearing is passive. Hearing is what you engage when you're in a public place and that person decides on their cell phone to use speakerphone and carry on their conversation as if you weren't there. That's hearing. But listening is when you're sitting with your spouse or your child or your friend, or maybe even, heaven forbid, a preacher on a Sunday morning. When we're actively listening for God, our antennas are up and we are tuned for God's frequency. But we're also actively invited to respond to God. The psalmist says today, "Let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving." None of this response is passive. We are not bystanders in God's rest like we are in our rest. God expects us to participate in his rest. Now, entering into God's rest will not be easy. Definitely not as easy as grabbing a snack and being a couch potato. Entering into God's rest is an experience of resistance. Expect resistance when you attempt to enter into God's rest. The first thing that will put up a fight is our own minds. Our own minds will put up this fight. It will try to convince us that we're bored. It'll tell you just one show. Just one show. That's not too bad. It'll tell you, just check your phone. 15 minutes. That's all. That's not too bad. That won't hurt you, it will say. It's going to come in and remind you the grass needs to be cut. Leaves need to be raked. The laundry needs to be done. Our minds are going to put up this fight because our minds are used to our definition of rest, not God's definition of rest. As you fight that battle with your own mind, the outside world decides this is the time we're going to pile on. This is the time the phone will ring and your friends will invite you out to lunch. The kids or the grandkids are going to want to ride somewhere. The outside world starts to recognize that you're doing something different. And the outside world doesn't like that. They don't like when people go against the flow. And like any powerful and fearful tyrant, it will try to get you back in line. Back into the crowd, mindlessly running on the hamster wheel. God's rest is an act of resistance. It's you standing up to the world and saying no. A hard word for many of us to say. It's you standing up and saying, I am answerable and responsible to a greater power than you. I know the majority is going this way, but the one that I answer to is telling me to go that one. And when you realize and enter into God's rest, you will realize that it is freeing, not restrictive. Because God's rest holds a mirror up to each and every one of our lives as individuals, and God's rest holds a mirror up to us as a church family. What it shows us is, what have we become slaves to? Have we become slaves to distraction? Have we become slaves to convenience? Have we become slaves to, if I don't get what I want, I will search somewhere else? We can barely stand in line at a convenience store without having to be distracted by the computers most of us carry in our pockets and in our handbags. Have you ever noticed how shocked a retail worker is when you look them in the eye and ask them, "How are you? How's your day going?" God's rest is the opposite of our rest, because it is neither distracting nor convenient. God's rest is focused and inconvenient. God's rest turns our attention away from what we are giving up by entering into it and turns it towards what we are gaining. And what we are gaining is dedicated time with our Maker, with our Sustainer, with our God. God's rest frees us from the wheel of suffering. God's rest takes us off that wheel, moves us to the outside so we can look at it and get a full picture of it and realize that we're running to nowhere. Sabbath is us as individuals and us as a church family drawing a line in the sand, softening our hearts to God, and following God's commandments, all 10 of them. God's Sabbath is us saying no to the world and yes to Him. Taking time every week to put your chasing and your running aside and be still. Be still in the presence of God. For His promise of entering His rest still stands to all of us, each and every one of us. And when we are still, He promises that He is there waiting for us.